Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and varnish as Ella Lawson stepped into the carpenter's workshop. It was tucked between a mechanic's garage and a run-down kiosk selling dusty snacks, the kind of place she wouldn't usually set foot in. Her black heels made an awkward sound on the uneven cement floor, a sharp contrast to the soft jazz still playing in her car outside. She held the antique chair close to her chest, careful not to jostle it. Its left leg had snapped clean off, and one armrest hung loose. It had belonged to her mother, one of the last physical things she had left of her. The sentimental weight of it was what brought her here, to this unpolished place that smelled like sawdust and forgotten time. She hadn't expected anyone to greet her. The shop looked almost abandoned. But as she stood adjusting her grip on the chair, a voice from the back called out, low and calm, "You can bring it in, madam." She turned toward the voice and saw him, a tall, lean man in a faded blue shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing arms lightly dusted with sawdust and old scars. His skin glowed slightly with sweat under the single overhead bulb. He didn't smile, but his eyes held something, curiosity maybe, or patience. She couldn't decide. "You want this fixed?" he asked, stepping forward to examine the chair without waiting for permission. His fingers traced the damage gently, like a doctor diagnosing a wound. She nodded, a little taken aback by how quietly confident he seemed. "It's an old piece," she added needlessly. He didn't respond, just crouched beside the chair and murmured, almost to himself, "Mahogany. Handcrafted. Maybe 60 years old. Nigerian mid-century, from the way it's joined." Ella blinked. She hadn't expected knowledge from him, let alone this calm authority. "You're the carpenter?" she asked. "Apprentice," he said, glancing up briefly. "But I know my way around things that break." She didn't smile, but something inside her shifted, something she hadn't noticed was locked. He told her to return in 2 days, gave no receipt, and didn't ask for payment up front. That should have been a red flag, but it wasn't. There was something unhurried about him, like he lived outside of time and noise. That night, back in her sleek apartment with glass walls and imported rugs, Ella found herself thinking about the carpenter's apprentice and the quiet way he'd handled her chair. He hadn't looked at her the way most men did, with calculation or admiration. He hadn't really looked at her at all, and that stayed with her. The next morning, she told herself she was only checking in on the chair, that it might need a special polish, that maybe she'd bring a reference photo of how it used to look. She dressed simply this time, in jeans and a cotton blouse, and left her driver behind. But deep down, she knew it wasn't about the chair anymore. It was about something else, something she didn't yet have the name for. Ella arrived just after noon, the sun casting long shadows over the corrugated roof of the workshop. She hadn't brought the reference photo like she told herself she would. In fact, she came empty-handed, save for 2 paper cups of coffee, and a quiet hope that she wouldn't be the only one wondering what it meant, that moment between them. The shop was quieter than the last time, no hammering, no buzz of saws, just the distant hum of the city and the smell of sun-warmed wood. She spotted him at the back, seated on a low stool, planing a plank in slow, steady strokes. This time, he looked up before she spoke, his brow lifting slightly in recognition, but still offering no smile. "You came early," he said, brushing curls of wood off his lap. She handed him a cup. "Thought you might need a break," she said, trying to sound casual. He took it without hesitation, the heat of his fingers brushing hers for a second too long. Then, in a voice softer than she expected, he said, "Thank you." They sat there for a moment, the quiet wrapping around them like an old blanket, and drank without speaking. The conversation flowed easier the second time. She learned his name was Kola. Just Kola, no surname offered. He was from Osun State. He spoke Yoruba with a slight Abadan drawl, though his English was crisp, deliberate, with a rhythm that suggested he thought carefully before speaking. He'd been apprenticing for almost 2 years, having left university after his father died. Ella didn't press for more. He didn't offer. Instead, they talked about ordinary things: food, music, weather, how Lagos seemed to never sleep. She laughed at one of his jokes, one that caught her off guard with its cleverness, and he chuckled, looking almost shy. She caught herself watching him when he turned away, tracing the lines of his jaw with her eyes, the way his hands moved with purpose even while he spoke. There was something grounded about him, something that made the noise of her own world feel distant. He didn't seem impressed by her wristwatch or the designer bag she'd casually slung over her shoulder. It was a strange, refreshing sort of invisibility, and she didn't know whether to be insulted or intrigued by it. Over the next few days, she found more reasons to stop by. Once to ask if he could look at a wobbly table in her guest room. Another time to bring him a sandwich she claimed she accidentally made extra of. Each visit felt natural, like slipping into something familiar, though she could feel the quiet tension building with each passing hour spent near him. He never asked for her number, but when she offered it, he took it with a hesitant nod. When she sent a message that evening, just a simple "got home safe." Thanks for the chat, he didn't reply until hours later. Glad you got home safe too. That night, Ella lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her apartment, wondering why a carpenter's apprentice had started haunting her thoughts like a half-remembered melody. She wasn't used to uncertainty. She wasn't used to waiting. But something about Kola made her want to wait. Just a little longer. The apartment Kola returned to each evening was a world away from the quiet stillness of Ella's visits. It was small, one room carved into sections with worn-out curtains and makeshift shelves. A mattress lay on the floor beside a fan that rattled when it turned. The air smelled of dried pepper and antiseptic. Amaka sat by the window, her swollen feet resting on a low stool, shelling beans into a metal bowl. Her belly was round and heavy now, the baby due in a matter of weeks. When Kola walked in that night, his shirt clinging to him from the walk, she didn't greet him with a smile. She'd been watching the clock. "You said 2 hours," she said quietly. He sat down beside her and kissed her cheek without answering. Amaka didn't push further, but her eyes lingered on his face longer than usual. She noticed the change in his scent, faint traces of expensive perfume that didn't belong to her. She didn't ask about it, not yet, but she knew. Kola didn't plan to tell Amaka about Ella. Not at first, but hiding things from her had always made him uncomfortable. She had known him when he had nothing, before the apprenticeship, before the idea of a future. Amaka was never loud, never dramatic. But she was sharp. And tonight, after they finished eating quietly on the floor, she simply asked, "Who is she?" He didn't pretend not to know who she meant. He told her that a wealthy client had taken interest in his work, that she had money and influence, and she liked to talk. "She thinks I'm useful," he said. "She trusts me." Amaka listened without blinking. "And you trust her?" He looked away. "I trust what she can give us." He let the words hang. The silence between them grew heavier. Then he said what he had been turning over in his mind for days. "If I play this right, we won't have to raise our child like this. We could move, start something small, open a workshop. You could rest." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. He didn't tell her about the coffee, or how Ella laughed at his jokes, or the quiet way her eyes searched his when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't say how he had begun to feel important in her presence, seen, even. Amaka looked down at her belly, then back at him. "You do what you have to do," she said at last. "Just don't forget who you are." From that night on, the distance between them grew. It wasn't hostile, but it settled quietly, like dust on furniture. Kola stayed out later. Amaka started writing down every expense, every coin spent. She asked fewer questions, but watched more carefully. When Kola told her Ella had invited him for lunch, just lunch, Amaka nodded, her face unreadable. "Be smart," she said. "These people, they don't love people like us. They collect us." Kola didn't respond. He didn't like the sound of that, even if he didn't disagree. Deep down, he wanted to believe he was the one in control, the one playing the game. But each time Ella looked at him with that quiet admiration, it became harder to remember the plan. Harder to remember Amaka waiting at home, dreaming of a better life while folding old baby clothes given to her by her sister. For now, Kola told himself there was still a line he wouldn't cross. But the problem with lines is that they blur so easily, especially in the dark. It was a Sunday afternoon when Ella first invited Kola to her home. The rain had just stopped, leaving the streets glossy and cool. She'd picked him up herself. Her driver was off for the weekend, and they drove through Ikoyi's leafy roads in near silence. Kola sat beside her, still in his work clothes, damp around the collar. He felt out of place, his rough hands resting awkwardly on his lap as the air conditioning brushed against his skin. When they arrived, she led him up to a penthouse apartment that overlooked the city, the scent of citrus and polished wood filling the space. Kola hesitated at the doorway, as though crossing into her world required permission he hadn't earned. "Come in," she said simply, as though he did this sort of thing all the time. She offered him wine, but he asked for water. She offered music, but he said he preferred silence. And so, the two of them stood there in the muted calm of her world, the gulf between them narrowing with every unspoken word. They sat in her living room, surrounded by minimalist furniture and soft lighting. Kola studied everything, the books stacked without dust, the black and white photos on the wall, the untouched fireplace that seemed built more for show than use. Ella noticed his eyes moving and smiled gently. "You're trying not to look impressed," she teased. He didn't deny it. "It's a different kind of life," he said quietly. She nodded, almost sadly. "One I didn't build alone." She told him about her late father, a stern businessman who taught her how to read balance sheets before bedtime stories. Her mother, soft-spoken and tired from a marriage that felt more like a transaction. "This place," she said, "was paid for in sacrifices." Kola listened, not out of obligation, but genuine interest. She didn't speak like the women he knew. There was a heaviness in her voice, but also clarity. And when she laughed, it was as though something inside her broke loose, something rarely allowed. Later, as she walked him to the door, she pressed a small box into his palm. "Just something to thank you for fixing the chair." Inside was a wristwatch. Not flashy, but expensive, subtle wealth. He hesitated, his pride flaring for a brief second. But he took it. She closed his fingers over it and said, "Don't think too much. It suits you." When Kola returned home that night, Amaka was asleep, one hand resting over her belly like a shield. He watched her from the doorway, guilt pooling in his chest. He told himself it was just a watch, just a conversation, just a kind gesture. But the truth gnawed at him in quiet moments. He had felt something at Ella's apartment, something dangerous. 4 days after, he found himself reaching for the watch at odd times, touching it like a charm. Ella messaged often now, nothing flirty, not directly, but personal. She told him what she was reading, what songs reminded her of the rainy afternoon. She asked how he was, how his days went, and he responded. Carefully at first, but then more openly, more eagerly. Amaka noticed his mood shifts, the way he lingered at the mirror before leaving, the smile he tried to hide when his phone buzzed. One evening, as he stepped into the hallway to answer a call, she stood in the kitchen, her hand tightening around the handle of a spoon, her heart sinking slowly. She didn't cry. Not yet. But in her silence, something in her began to harden. The plan didn't come all at once. It began like a whisper, an idle thought Kola tried to swat away in the quiet hours of the night. But each time he saw Ella's name light up his phone, each time she laughed softly at something he said, the whisper grew louder. It wasn't just about the gifts anymore. It was the way she looked at him, like he was worth more than his station, more than the roughness under his nails and the borrowed shirts. He began to imagine a different life, one where he wore suits instead of coveralls, where he held her hand in public instead of hiding in the background. And slowly, dangerously, that fantasy began to feel more real than anything waiting for him at home. He still returned to Amaka each evening, still placed his palm gently on her belly, and listened for the baby's quiet movements, but his thoughts were far away, lost in a world of polished wood floors and chilled wine, where no one asked him to fix anything but himself. Amaka wasn't blind to the shift. She watched him with a quiet intensity now, collecting signs like stones in her pocket. She didn't ask where he went during the day. His lies were too smooth now, rehearsed. But when she spoke to her sister over the phone, her voice changed. She used words like maybe, just in case, and backup. She began putting small amounts of money aside from the food budget, hiding it in a hollowed-out book beneath the mattress. She didn't know what Kola was doing, not exactly, but she knew enough to prepare. One evening, while he bathed, she opened his old satchel and found a small notebook tucked deep inside, pages filled with numbers and sketches, business ideas. He'd always talked about opening his own shop, but now there were details, names, locations, costs, and next to it, a note in a woman's handwriting. We could build something. You just have to ask. Amaka sat very still, the notebook heavy in her lap. The baby kicked softly beneath her ribs, as if reminding her to breathe. Kola, meanwhile, had begun to think beyond the workshop. He floated the idea to Ella casually, mentioning a dream of owning a space, something small but honest. She'd been intrigued, even excited. "Send me your ideas," she said. "I'd love to see what you're thinking." The door opened wider. She wasn't just charmed by him anymore. She believed in him. That belief felt intoxicating. He drafted a proposal late one night, careful and clean, and sent it off. She replied the next morning, "Let's talk. I think we can make this happen." The words stirred something in him, something greedy and hopeful. He imagined telling Amaka they'd made it, that the plan had worked, that she could relax now. But when he rehearsed the words in his head, they tasted hollow. And then, without meaning to, he found himself wondering if she even needed to be part of the new life at all. A shop, a fresh start, a different woman. One who didn't remind him of where he came from. The idea settled into his thoughts like a seed, and though he didn't know it yet, it had already begun to grow. Amaka began to count Kola's silences more than his words. The way he no longer touched her belly with wonder, the way he chewed slower, distracted, like every bite was taking him farther away. She moved through their home carefully now, her own presence shrinking as his absence grew, even while he sat across from her. Some nights she would wake and find the bed empty, the sound of his footsteps soft in the corridor as he answered late-night messages. He never said her name anymore unless it was necessary. She never asked whose name filled the quiet instead, but her eyes stayed sharp. She noticed the new phone case he hadn't bought with his own money, the subtle scent of cologne she hadn't gifted him, the wristwatch he sometimes forgot to take off before coming home. These were not the signs of a man surviving hardship. They were the signs of a man being slowly pulled into another world. The day she found the discarded receipt from a high-end restaurant in his trousers pocket, she sat down and stared at it for a long time. There was only one meal listed, one wine, a date. Her chest tightened, not from surprise, but confirmation. That night, when he returned home and kissed her forehead out of habit, she didn't flinch. She smiled and asked how his day went. He told her about work in vague terms and slipped off his shoes like nothing was broken. But something shifted inside Amaka then. She was done waiting for the truth to unravel on its own. She had been with Kola through things that stripped him both of dignity. She had cleaned his wounds when he returned home bloodied from a street fight. She had sold her phone once so they could eat for a week. And now he was preparing to leave her behind, pregnant and tired, as if she was just a weight around his ankle. She couldn't fight Ella with beauty or money, but she could fight with truth. 2 days later, she followed him. She borrowed her sister's phone and took a tricycle as far as she could, then walked the rest of the way. She stayed across the street and watched as he stepped into the silver car that picked him up, Ella behind the wheel, wearing sunglasses and smiling like she owned the day. Amika didn't cry. She took pictures. She waited until they disappeared around the bend, then turned and walked home. That evening, while Cola sat beside Ella on a rooftop lounge discussing the color palette of a future store, Amika was back at their apartment, packing slowly. Not to leave, but to prepare. She no longer hoped he would come clean. She no longer wished for him to choose her. But she intended to make sure that when he did choose, it would cost him. Because sometimes, silence is not surrender. It's strategy. And Amika had just found her weapon. Ella had started to notice the shadows in Cola's smile. It wasn't obvious at first. He still answered her messages promptly, still listened when she talked about her gallery plans or the things that kept her up at night. But there was a slowness in his eyes, a hesitation in his laugh. He had started deflecting her questions about his life beyond their conversations. Whenever she asked about his family or where he went after their meetings, he would shift the topic or offer vague replies. Still, she didn't push. Not because she didn't suspect something, but because she didn't want to ruin what felt rare. Ella had been around long enough to know that people often wore masks for a reason. But something inside her, something quiet and unnerving, had begun to whisper that she didn't know Cola at all. One night, as he walked her to her car after dinner, she asked, "What are you not telling me?" He looked at her, genuinely startled, and for a moment, she saw panic flash behind his calm. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing important." She didn't believe him. But she didn't say that either. That same evening, Cola sat at the edge of his bed, phone in hand, fingers hovering over a message he hadn't yet sent. It wasn't to Ella. It was a message to someone he once trusted with everything, Amika. He hadn't told her yet, but in his mind, he'd already made the decision. He wasn't going to keep pretending. He had started writing the message 5 different times, but each time he stopped, overwhelmed by a fear he hadn't felt in years. She knew too much. Her silence was beginning to feel too calculated, too sharp. She no longer asked him where he had been, no longer waited at the door, yet her presence in the room had grown heavier. He'd noticed the way she kept her phone closer, how she whispered when speaking to her sister. The walls of the apartment, once dull and worn, now felt like they were listening. And every time he tried to look Amaka in the eyes, he felt something watching him back, something calm, but far from forgiving. In that stillness, he began to suspect she was no longer just waiting to be left behind. She was preparing for something. Amaka didn't need to wait much longer. The moment came quietly, a slip of timing that gave her everything she needed. Cola had left his second phone, an old device she hadn't seen in months, charging beside the bed. He was in the shower. She hesitated for a second, then picked it up. There was no password. Inside, she found photos, Ella's house, her face, screenshots of bank transfers, the proposal drafts. But what made her stomach twist were the voice notes. Some from Ella, sweet and curious, and then some from Cola himself. Ones he hadn't sent, ones where he rehearsed how to break things off with Amaka. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed. "I'll make sure she's okay," he said in one. "I'll give her something and disappear." That word, disappear, coiled in Amaka's chest like a wire. But the one that changed everything came last, almost a whisper. "If she gets in the way, I'll handle it." She listened to it 3 times, her face frozen. Then she placed the phone back where it was, picked up her own, and sent a message to a number she hadn't yet saved. "We need to talk." Please don't ignore this. She hesitated only briefly before hitting send. Then she closed her eyes and waited. Not for Cola, but for Ella's reply. Ella didn't reply immediately. She stared at the message for nearly an hour, reading and rereading it as if a single word might shift meaning. We need to talk. It's about Cola. Please don't ignore this. She could have blocked the number. She could have laughed and dismissed it as envy or desperation. But she didn't. Something in her chest had already begun to stir long before that message arrived. Doubts had crept into her thoughts like cracks in a window pane, small, harmless at first, but now threatening to split everything. She replied simply, where and when. The location they agreed on was a cafe in Surreylir, neutral, quiet, far from both of their homes. Ella arrived early, dressed down in jeans and a long, dark cardigan. No driver, no assistant. She wanted to blend in, to listen, not to posture. When Amaka entered a few minutes later, there was no grand confrontation, no scene. Just a tired woman in a loose, faded dress, her stomach rounding beneath the fabric, her face pale but focused. They sat across from each other like two people at the edge of a shared truth. Amaka didn't speak with bitterness. Her voice was low, even. She didn't beg or accuse. She simply told Ella the story Cola hadn't. Their years together, the early struggles, the baby that kicked through sleepless nights. She laid it out like someone presenting evidence, not for pity, but for clarity. I'm not here because I want him back, she said, holding Ella's gaze. I'm here because I know what he's capable of. She showed her the screenshots, the voice note, the photos, the conversations he never deleted. At first, Ella didn't blink. She absorbed it with a kind of numb composure. But when she listened to the recording, the part where Cola whispered, if she gets in the way, her breath caught. That whisper wasn't just careless. It was calculated. Cold. Not a man caught between two lives. A man already planning how to erase one. Ella leaned back, her arms crossed tightly. She had believed in Cola, seen something different in him. But now she realized she hadn't discovered him. She'd been shown what he wanted her to see, a version he curated for sympathy and opportunity. The air between them thickened with a new kind of alliance, unexpected but real. Two women, both deceived, both betrayed. Ella didn't say much at first. She simply nodded, asked a few quiet questions, and looked out the window for a long time. Finally, she turned to Amaka and said he thinks he's still in control. Amaka nodded. He thinks I'll stay quiet. And that was all it took. No revenge plot, no shouting. Just a slow, deliberate agreement sealed over cold tea and shared silence. Let's give him exactly what he wants, Ella said at last. Until he asks for too much. Amaka smiled faintly. It wasn't joy, it was survival. She had walked into that cafe with the weight of betrayal on her shoulders. Now she walked out with something heavier, but stronger, knowledge. And beside her, the woman Cola had tried to use now walked as an unexpected ally. They didn't know yet how it would all end. But they both knew one thing. He would never see it coming. The days that followed were quieter than expected. Cola moved through them with the confidence of a man who believed his path was finally clearing. Ella had grown warmer again, her messages more frequent, her laughter easier. She asked him to help her sketch out more business ideas, introduced him to a friend who managed a small investment firm, even hinted at putting him in touch with a lawyer who could help with the paperwork. Everything he had dreamt about was materializing. And Amaka, she'd gone still. She no longer questioned his late returns or searched his face for answers. She smiled more, even joked during dinner, and sometimes placed his hand on her belly again, like old times. He took it as acceptance, as if her silence meant surrender. But under his arrogance, something else stirred, a creeping unease he couldn't place. At night, he found it harder to sleep. He'd wake at odd hours, checking both phones for messages that never came, then staring at the ceiling, unsure whether to feel triumph or terror. Ella, meanwhile, played her part with precision. She scheduled a meeting with Cola at her home on a Thursday evening, telling him she wanted to finalize the figures for the shop. She wore a simple blouse, soft blue, and lit only a few lamps to keep the mood intimate. When he arrived, she greeted him with a brief hug, then poured him a glass of his favorite drink, one he had mentioned in passing weeks ago, which she had pretended to forget. He was impressed. He felt wanted. He didn't notice her glances toward the hallway, or the fact that her laptop screen never really lit up with spreadsheets. As he spoke, Ella leaned forward, nodding, eyes wide, but behind them, her thoughts ticked like clockwork. Every word he said now sounded like theater. She no longer saw a man trying to escape poverty. She saw a man building an illusion. He boasted subtly about sacrifices, about wanting to do right by people. Ella smiled, her expression soft. But her hands were calm because she already knew how the scene would end. 10 minutes into their conversation, there was a soft knock at the door. Cola paused. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked, brows raised. Ella stood up slowly. "Actually," she said, her tone measured, "I thought you should meet someone." Before he could reply, the door opened wider, and Amaka stepped in. She looked steady, composed, dressed neatly in a loose black gown, and a headscarf that framed her face like armor. For a long moment, no one said anything. Cola rose from his seat, confused, then wary. "What is this?" he asked, voice dipping with dread. Ella didn't answer. Amaka walked forward, holding her phone in her hand. With deliberate calm, she tapped the screen and played the recording again, the voice note that had once felt like nothing but planning. "If she gets in the way, I'll handle it." The room darkened in silence. Cola's face drained of color. "You both," he began, but the words fell apart. Ella looked at him, her voice low and certain. "No more lies, Cola. Not here." And finally, the walls he had built, carefully, quietly, began to close in. For a long moment, Cola didn't speak. He looked from Ella to Amaka as though expecting one of them to laugh, to reveal it was all a twisted test of loyalty. But nothing came, no softening, no forgiveness. The silence pressed on his chest like weight. The voice note still played in his head over and over, now no longer a plan but a confession. He opened his mouth, reached for words, but found only the dry scrape of panic. "It's not what you think," he said finally, but his voice was too thin, too rehearsed. Amaka stared at him with quiet steadiness, her arms folded across her chest. "You said you loved me," she said softly, not as a plea, but as a verdict. Ella didn't look at him at all. Her eyes were on her phone now, her fingers scrolling, then stopping. "You should sit down," she said coldly. "Or at least try to look calm when the police get here." Cola blinked. "The what?" he asked, stepping back. But he already knew. Somewhere in the depths of him he had felt it coming. Just not like this. Not together. The doorbell rang like a strike of fate. Cola stood frozen as Ella opened the door. 2 uniformed officers stepped in, polite but firm. "Mr. Cola Ajayi?" one asked. Cola didn't respond. "You've been named in a report involving attempted coercion, emotional fraud, and verbal threats of harm." Amaka handed them the flash drive she had carried in her purse, her fingers steady as stone. "All your words," she said. "Every single one." The officers approached him, reading him his rights in measured tones. Cola tried to speak, tried to say something that would undo the moment, but even he knew it was too late. The performance was over. The lies had crumbled, and no one was clapping. As they took him by the arms, he turned to Ella, his voice hoarse. "I loved you." She didn't flinch. "No," she said. You loved what you thought I could give you, and when that stopped being enough, you started planning your escape. Then he turned to Amaka, expecting anger, tears, anything. But she only looked at him as one might look at a stranger passing in the street. Later, when the door closed and the house grew still again, Ella sank into her chair slowly, her shoulders finally relaxing for the first time in days. Amaka remained standing, her hands resting lightly on her stomach. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Ella broke the silence. "I didn't think I'd ever believe another woman again," she murmured. Amaka offered a faint, tired smile. "Sometimes it's the only person who knows what you've been through." They sat like that for a while, two women from different worlds, drawn together not by friendship but by survival. They didn't speak of Kola anymore. He was gone now, left to face consequences he thought he could outrun. What mattered now was what came after. Ella poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to Amaka. No toast, no grand words. Just the quiet understanding of women who had rebuilt something, not out of spite, but out of truth. And as dusk settled outside, they sat together in the calm that followed the storm, no longer bound by betrayal, but by a new kind of beginning. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.